from the Salem Historical Society are at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Wendell Davis on Broadway. And Mr. Davis knows a lot about the educational opportunities in Salem. And he will tell us first, I think it'd be a good idea if he gave a little background of his family, where he was born, where he was educated, and then when he came to Salem.
Well, I was born in Fall River, Massachusetts, and I graduated from the Durfee High School in Fall River. Then I went to prep school in Wolfboro, New Hampshire at Brewster Academy, and then graduated from the University of New Hampshire. I started my graduate study at Middlebury College. I was a French major, but after 2 years there, I decided to go into administration, and I matriculated at Bates College, and I got my master's degree from Bates.
You had quite a variety of schools then, and get a real rounded education.
I came to Salem, and I started my teaching at Kensill Seminary in Kensill, Maine, and I taught and coached there. I was primarily a coach at the time, coaching football, baseball, and basketball, and I taught math. I went to Tilton School, Tilton Prep School in Tilton, New Hampshire, and I taught there for 15 years, primarily French and algebra, and I coached the 3 major sports and was the athletic director. I came to Salem in 1945 as a teacher coach and unofficially the assistant headmaster. In 1949, I became principal of the high school, and in 1956, I became superintendent of schools covering 5 towns: Salem, Plaster, New Hampshire, Hampstead, New Hampshire, Atkinson, New Hampshire, and Newton, New Hampshire.
I might suggest, who was the principal preceding you?
Eugene Rook was my principal.
And Nelson was the superintendent?
Mr. Nelson hired me as the superintendent, as a teacher, and the next year, Monroe Grandy came in as superintendent of schools.
Oh,
and
yes.
he stayed here 3 years, and then as principal, I worked under Jonathan Osgood for approximately 6 years.
I was almost forgetting some of those superintendents. I thought you almost jumped from Nelson to superintendent. That's good to get that in the record.
And then, just before I retired, Salem became a single school district, and I finished my career as superintendent of schools for Salem.
Well, you retired in what year?
1967.
Oh, the question I had was, then you did see Salem through the transition to a single supervisory unit?
Yes.
Yes. That's a good point, to know that one man saw the whole
And
change.
primarily, when I was superintendent of schools for the union, my emphasis basically was on Salem, because we had to spread our time, so-called, and the assistant superintendent did a little bit more in terms of the other 4 towns.
Where did you have your central office?
My central office was in Plastow.
Yeah, that's where it was
Yes.
for a long while. Now,
Actually, you've seen Salem educationally through a whole bunch of transitions.
Yes.
You have some information you're going to give us on number of classrooms and so forth, and you've seen it through the growth, but you've also seen it organizationally through the transition.
Yes.
Becoming a supervisory union of its own. This is...
Because I was superintendent at the time of when we were going to Concord and trying to present to the legislature all the reasons why we should become a separate
No,
school
you
district.
can't. Londonderry's trying to tackle it now, and apparently not getting very far with it, I gather.
no, the state didn't like to have
The state
these
has
unions
a
broken
entirely
up.
different philosophy, and
Yeah.
because originally no small town could afford a superintendent to get the quality education they hoped, and so they just had to pool their resources more or less, and having one person cover various towns. And of course, I was the one that had to attend all of the school meetings and was the key person in terms of even the other towns, because they wanted the superintendent at their meetings, not an assistant, and that basically was the way it was all the time. And you had to get involved with their building programs. Now, I talk about the building programs here in Salem, or I will talk about them, but at the same time, every one of those other towns, including Timberlane, all had to build, and because the growth, they had the same relative growth as we did, perhaps not as much.
Where does the Timberlane district come in? Was it created at the time that Salem?
No, prior to that.
Was prior to that.
A few years before that, and that was set up in this respect. That became finally three. Well, let me say this: Timberlane now is composed of 4 towns: Atkinson, Plastow, Sandown, and Danville. And those 4 towns are the Timberlane unit. So at the end of my time as a superintendent, I was a superintendent for Timberlane, which covered those 4 towns. I was a superintendent for Hampstead, and I was a superintendent for Salem. Newton had gone with the Kingston group, and so that they were not part of Timberlane or part of the Union at the end of my career.
One time, the town of Hampton was included in the supervisory union that we are in, now Salem was in.
Yes, that I don't know about. That was before my
That was
time.
before your time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Was that during your time as a board member?
No, it was before my time. Yes. We had some other towns, though, when I was on. I can't just recall them now without looking them up. I wouldn't dare to quote them. I don't think the educational department in Concord realized the growth that Salem was in when they were trying to fight Salem in becoming a supervisory district of its own.
No, even though I knew the feeling of the state board, I felt personally how difficult it was for me to be spread so thin and to be as creative as you would like. You had to, and it was just as important to be in a meeting in Newton to decide or to debate some little $2 item or some little incident in the classroom, and they were just as concerned as a more major problem or a much more expensive item in the bigger school's budget.
Well, the feel I've begun to get for Salem in terms of its explosion, its growth explosion, was that it set in after World War II and after people began to reassemble.
That's right.
And in your dates, having come here in 45 and become principal in 49 and superintendent in 56, would suggest that you really were more than any other single person the leader in a leadership position in the time of the explosion as it manifested itself educationally.
That's true.
And so,
Very true.
hopefully you have some facts and figures for us on that population explosion as it affected our schools.
Well, yes, I'd be happy to, discuss that. And when I came to Salem in 1945, we had approximately 600 pupils in the public schools. And the population in Salem was about 4,000.
Right.
Well, to see the growth up to the present time, the school population now is 5,240, which is a gain of between 800 and 900%. And the population is approximately 25,000, which is roughly 600 to 700%.
That's right.
Most people might not realize, but we had at that time 5 elementary schools totaling 12 rooms. And the largest school was the present Frost School, which had 4 rooms.
The Frost School is not now being used, you mean?
It
Yes,
isn't being
the
used, it
Frost.
was given to the town.
But that
that was the big elementary
building was the
school
biggest
when
one
I
you had.
first came.
That's right.
The elementary school. We did have a high school, and it had 9 rooms plus an auditorium, and that housed 6th grades, 7 through 12. Now, in contrast, we have 90 elementary classrooms in 7 modern schools, plus 16 classrooms used for grade 6 in the high school. We have in Woodbridge Junior High approximately 39 classrooms and 79 classrooms in Salem High School. Quite a change from 1945.
Hard to believe. Unless you get it down on tape, future generations won't believe the rapid growth that Salem had during your period.
This school growth has made it necessary to build schools, and I have witnessed in Salem at least 12 construction programs. It all started in 1949 with the Central School and gym addition to the old high school.
Is that what I need, Central School? You spoke of that before.
Well, the Woodbury, when Salem, when we had originally the Woodbury School,
Just
which
the main
was the
part.
front part, the
The
east
end.
Yeah.
Then they built next to it the Central School,
A separate building it was.
and then at
Wasn't
the same
connected.
time they built that, they put in a high school gym, and that was the first addition.
That was dedicated in 1900 and
Well, that was 1949-50. It was dedicated in 1950.
That's right.
But there have been several additions to the Woodbury School.
And those two buildings were not connected in those days.
The first addition to Woodbury School was a science and shop wing,
Yeah, on the east side.
and then we connected the schools
So that's
and did over and built
Another gymnasium.
another
Well, how many
area.
times has Woodbury School been enlarged? It was built in 24
Let's
or
see,
25.
1, 2, 3. 3 times, isn't it? 3 times would be.
Just a minute, I think I have that information. In 1945-50, the Central School and gym addition to the high school. Then we added 4 rooms at the Fourth School. Then we had a 4-room addition to the Central School. So that was added to the Central School, although that wasn't really the Woodbury High School. In 1954 came the Hague School, and then a second addition to Woodbury High School for a shop and science wing.
So that made 4 additions.
1957 was the 5th school. 1960 was the 3rd addition to Woodbury High School to include new shops, gym, cafeteria, and classrooms. In 1962, we built the Seoul School and the Hague addition. In 1965 came the Salem High School. 1967, the 3 elementary schools, Barron, Lancaster, and North Salem. And in 1968, an addition to the Barron School.
Right.
And the last one, 1969, was the Salem High addition.
That 1960 edition of Woodbury, which was the 3rd edition, is the one I'm interested to get these various loose ends tied together that Mrs. Ralston talked about as having been done in her
Yeah.
tenure on the board.
Yes, I
The
believe
3rd
so.
edition of the Woodbury School is the one she was talking about.
I think so. And that was connecting 2 schools and adding another gymnasium, wasn't it?
Yes. And we had problems during these years to find housing while schools were being constructed. And
Right.
sometimes the bond issue didn't pass on the first attempt.
Gary's having that problem.
At one time, we
You
were...
made a recent statement in our meeting that I'm sure the facts will bear out, but that probably more often than not, school proposals have had to be re-proposed or reconsidered,
And every time it did, it just cost the
Oh.
taxpayer that much more.
it's not a political comment now
No.
because we're past that. But
I
the
know
fact
it,
is
but
it's
I
history.
knew there was a lost cause when
Yeah.
I mentioned it, but the point was that I just had to say it because I've noticed that, and of course in all of these times, when we first came to Salem, the tax rate in Salem was below the state average. And it kept that way until we started all of this construction, and it just seemed that the tax rate went up when construction started, and it just seems to go together, and there's not too much you can do about it. But in my feeling was that every time we waited, where the statistics showed that we needed a school, then the cost was that much greater. At one time, it was going up something like 12%, and the biggest example that I had mentioned was the fact of the addition to the high school. When we finally got it, it cost us $300,000 more with 27,000 square footage, which is false economy in a way. And I was just trying to put that point across.
To recap, I think you said you had some index, but many more times than not, there's been reconsideration. Have you any memory about how often?
No, I remember the first one, 1949, when they wanted this central school, and in addition to the high school. Monroe Granby was the superintendent, and he was the first one that even proposed anything. I'm sure Mr. Nelson, who came in, say, roughly in 1928, because he was here about 18 years, he never had to propose anything. There was no need as such. So Mr. Grandy came in, and this was his one thing that he did, was to set up a building program even in the 3 years he was here. I think perhaps the second year he proposed it, and it didn't. I think Mrs. Wilson was a board person then. It failed, and then we came back the next year and cut it down. I remember very fine, and eliminated things that we perhaps should have had, and then he proposed it the next year, and it went through with no opposition at all, and I'm sure we could have got some of the things we had cut out. We didn't even have a roof for the gymnasium. I mean, a ceiling for the gymnasium.
That's right.
He was afraid.
Didn't even have a floor, a wooden floor in there.
I remember.
I'm interested in the dynamics of how this was brought about, and you have some facts for us now. People, they didn't just willingly stand up and build school buildings. Apparently they built them out of some desperate need.
Well, that second year, there was a very good citizens group that had surveyed the needs of Salem. I remember Charlie Seifert, I think, was the chairman of that particular group, and they had a nice little brochure out that was presented, probably one of the first brochures that we had put out, and I was the high school principal at the time. And I think with this citizens group and the support of the board, and definitely a need, we proposed it the first time, and in the second time, I think it went over much better because the citizenry, the people were much more informed in terms of it.
One thing I was not prepared for, I hadn't realized, not having been here, is that there have been periods in Salem in which you had to go out and rent classrooms. You haven't had enough space for it.
That is one of the big problems that we had, and I recall that at one time we rented 26 classrooms in such places as the Hose House, the Town Hall, Fish and Game Club, and the various churches. And we used the St. Joseph's School, St. Joseph's Annex, Pleasant Street Church, Mary Queen of Peace, Congregational Church, and the Armenian Church. And we certainly appreciated their tremendous cooperation. In many instances, we had to build petitions that the school board, the school district paid for, and set up 4 rooms, 6 rooms, whatever was needed.
It seems a shame, though, that the public can't realize from the statistics you have here that when the need of a building is in evidence, that they don't build it that year. In nearly every case, as Mr. Davis has said, and I think they lost probably $500,000 in construction costs on one of the last big additions. It seems a shame, but you have to get the public really tuned up to building before they'll accept it, and they'll accept the higher cost.
There are some people criticized us unjustly at the time that we didn't have a little bit more foresight to build more rooms and
Right.
more schools, but we were unable to because our borrowing capacity did not permit it.
That's
We
right.
we could only spend according to what the state permitted us to
That's
borrow.
right.
Well, that's
And
the interesting thing. We're not even close to our borrowing capacity now.
No,
No.
no,
There was a period of
there
time.
was
a period of
it
time,
was right up
and
against it.
Right.
This was why many times, because it was expensive renting classrooms because we
Very
had no
expensive.
equity and no return. And sometimes we lost money, of course, in doing it, but many times we couldn't do otherwise because we didn't have the borrowing capacity. I think that's most important.
That's very important. You had to go to the legislature upstate to
Once or
increase
twice
the
we
borrowing.
went up there to have it increased.
That's
And, but then there was a period that almost every building we proposed, it did go through because the people had confidence in us. And one contribution I had that I made at the time, that I devised a formula in which I could project for several years ahead what the enrollment would be for future years. And this particular formula bore out quite accurately the population in subsequent years. And to this day, Mr. Johnson still uses that same formula because it has worked out pretty well. So I don't think in any instance we've ever asked for school housing without proving and showing a fair need.
I don't think there's many cases where you've built more schools than you need.
No, it hasn't.
Government stuff
I
is
hope
the
this
answer.
last year isn't an exception to that.
Well,
And there's a big debate on this one.
I think it's leveling off a little bit in the elementary grades, but we're still getting the upper grades, having more youngsters coming along that for
I don't know
whom you'll
what it
have to have housing.
You know, one contribution I think, it's obvious that you've made, that you may be modest about, but I appreciate any memories you have on this. You obviously have been a leader of people, and aside from your educational contribution, the function of bringing people together in difficult times and getting them to do what had to be done is an interesting thing in itself. How did you go about that? How did you get these people to do these things?
Well, I think it was a lot of people naturally helped.
Yeah.
Just like even before I came involved, before when I was high school principal, I had less to do at that particular point in that first building program. I think Monroe Grandy and the school board that Mrs. Woolston was on, and Charlie Seifert in that committee, sort of set the standard a little bit at that particular time. But I'll admit that most of my, let's say, service or being in office was involved with construction. And I think basically it's communication. So if you can communicate to the people a need and they trust you to the extent that this is what is best for Salem and their children, they pretty much will go along, because I think when it comes right down to it, the best investment we have, of course, are our children.
Well, one thing that helped is the fact that you had to rent these extra classrooms, and people got kind of sick of them. They wanted their children to attend a regular school building and not these outside rooms, because it took more transportation, and at that time they didn't want their children transported all over town.
Well, we couldn't give them as full a program.
No.
There wasn't enough. They couldn't have the athletic phase of it. It was more difficult to get the music involved and things of that nature. So it wasn't ideal, but we had to do it because we had to find space.
That's right.
One thing that I would like to mention, I haven't said much about curriculum. And when I came to Salem, the high school was straight college preparation, and we didn't offer too much else. And I believe the major changes started when I was high school principal, and I have the parents to thank. I never saw such a better example of parent participation than we had at that particular time. We worked through the Parent Teachers Association, which in those days was much more popular than it is now.
The phrase PTA doesn't occur anymore, does it?
No.
There's PTO.
And that is,
Well, there's
PTO
still-
is more or less their own group, and they don't have to be affiliated with a national group. And I'm not too familiar with how much PTA there is at the
I think
moment.
there's one or two groups.
But during that, my time as principal, PTA was much more active, and we attempted to utilize them as much as we could. And I remember one particular time when we had in conjunction with the PTA, we planned this meeting to work on developing a curriculum that would meet the needs of all the children. And we had 300 people. We divided into...
Roughly what year was this?
Well, it was, I would say roughly about 1953.
Yeah, I think that's
And,
about
You were
right.
principal and before
yes.
you was in the...
It was when I was principal. And and the principal in those days pretty much had to be the key person, because the superintendent has to spread so much in the respective towns. The principal acted as sort of the key education leader within each respective community. And so 300 people came that evening. We divided up into 30 groups, 10 groups of 30 each, to work on what they felt was the needs and priorities for Salem children. And then the needs and priorities were listed and summarized, and believe it or not, these priorities were accepted by the school board and incorporated into the curriculum in subsequent years. And first came SHOP in 1954, and through to 1962 came an order, band, special education, physical education grades 7 to 12, library, guidance, language lab, and art. At that time, we had no instructors for any one of those basic subjects. The principal, for example, was the guidance person. He not only did he administer his school, but he had to be the guidance counselor.
Now, while I might interrupt there, when you compare the number of specialists the school system has now for these different items, and the principal had all these responsibilities in those days, I often wonder how the pupils ever learned anything. If you just compare the different types of things the superintendent or the principal had charge of in those days in comparison to today, it's just amazing how we ever got anywhere.
Well, I can only say that's progress, Mr. Turner.
I guess so.
But it was interesting in how some of these, let's say, curriculum subjects developed. I'm thinking now particularly of special education. And in the old days, people didn't want to accept anything new if it cost money.
Right.
And they perhaps were not cognizant of a special type of student who we can call trainable and educable, and nothing was done about them. They were put in with everybody else,
That's right.
and they just couldn't make the progress. So we started one of the first school school districts in the state to have special education.
Well, Salem was one of the
Well,
first.
Hampton, I think, was first, and we went down there. I remember I went down there with one or two other people, and we found what Hampton was doing, and we were one, I would say we're pretty close to being probably the second school district. I know Nashua started soon after that, but in this part of the state, we were the only ones who were doing too much with special education, and we followed Hampton, I think, in that regard. And special education started in Mrs. Schutz,
That's
Mrs.
right.
Laurel
I
Schutz,
remember
Edith
that.
Schutz, in her class in her home, and we developed from one class to 4 classes. And now we have 2 educable classes, a trainable class, and also a older educable class in the Woodbury School.
And I believe they wish they could have more specialists along that line, even at the present time.
Since my time, they have added an emotional class to go along in this area. The language lab, for example, when we put that into the school, made it possible to offer 6 years of French. And now, to me, I thought that was quite an advancement, because taking 2 years of French, 2 years of Latin, or 2 years of Spanish, to me, wasn't anywhere near as worthwhile as being
Really heavy.